The Immortalists, Charles Lindbergh, Dr. Alexis Carrel, and Their Daring Quest to Live Forever, by David M. Friedman. Narrated by Todd, McLaren. Copyright 2007 by David M. Friedman. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Echo, an imprint of HarperCollins Publishers, and was produced in the year 2007 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Chapter 1. I will show you what I'm doing here. Charles Lindbergh's familiarity with prying gazes began on May 21, 1927, the day he became the most famous man in the world. That status was conferred on the unsuspecting 25-year-old literally overnight, when he was the first aviator to fly without stopping from New York to Paris, a feat that many people, even many aviators, had thought impossible. Making Lindbergh's triumph all the more newsworthy was that he flew without a co-pilot, a radio, or even a front window for 33.5 hours in a single-engine airplane made from wood, canvas, and piano wire. The New York Times showed its awe by devoting its first 5 pages to the dimple-chinned American's landing at Le Bourget, the dusty airfield where 100,000 Frenchmen, nearly all of them chanting, "Lindbergh! Lindbergh!" were so eager to stare at the spent pilot that they almost trampled him to death after he climbed out of his cockpit. Maintenance crews swept up a ton of personal items lost or abandoned in that love fest, including a sable coat and 6 sets of false teeth. In the week that followed, Lindbergh, in new clothes made by a Paris tailor, was seen by the President and Premier of France, the French Chamber of Deputies, and 1 million more Frenchmen who lined a parade route along the Champs-Élysées. After leaving France, he was presented to the King of Belgium, the King of England, who asked, "How did you pee?" and the Prince of Wales, the future Duke of Windsor, whom Lindbergh quickly replaced as the most photographed person on Earth. Returning home, he was gawked at by 300,000 Americans at the Washington Monument, where President Coolidge pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross on his chest. 4 million New Yorkers showered him with cheers and paper scraps, as 10,000 school children sang, "Hail the Conquering Hero Comes," in the largest ticker-tape parade the world had ever seen. Taking a 3-month victory lap, Lindbergh flew his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, to every state in the Union, rode in 1,300 miles of motorcades, gave 147 speeches, and was seen in the flesh by 30 million people, 1 out of every 4 Americans then living. Still, none of this prepared Lindbergh for the way he was stared at on November 28, 1930, the day the world's most famous man was introduced to the person some considered the world's smartest. Ironically, that day began with steps aimed at preventing Lindbergh from being stared at. Before entering his black Franklin sedan outside his rented home in Princeton, New Jersey, Lindbergh slipped a pair of lensless eyeglasses over his famously blue eyes and a fedora hat over his equally famous blonde hair. Much to his pleasure, he'd found this simple disguise was usually enough to afford him some privacy in public. Privacy was always important to Lindbergh, but it was crucial this morning because he wanted to think quietly in his car as he made the 2-hour drive into New York, without interruptions from the star-struck toll-takers or fellow motorists. What Lindbergh wanted to think about was the list of questions he planned to ask the man he was driving to meet, a man whose name he'd only recently heard for the first time. He heard it from Dr. Paluel Flagg, the anesthetist who attended Lindbergh's wife, the former Anne Morrow, when she gave birth to the Lindbergh's first child, Charles Jr., on June 22, 1930. Lindbergh had met his wife in December 1927 when he flew to Mexico City, an event that caused nearly as much pandemonium as his landing in Paris. Anne, then an introverted 21-year-old college student, was worried at first that her Christmas holiday with her family at the U.S. Embassy — her father, Dwight, was the American ambassador — would be spoiled by the presence of someone she called a sort of baseball player. But that anxiety vanished when the tall, handsome aviator took the ambassador's middle daughter on her first airplane flight, a thrill that Anne, a short brunette unsure of her own attractiveness, described in her diary in near orgasmic terms. Lindbergh moved so very little, in the cockpit. Yet you felt the harmony of it, she wrote. It was a complete and intense experience. The pilot and his sated passenger were married on May 27, 1929, in a secret ceremony at Next Day Hill, the Morrow family mansion, set on a verdant 50-acre estate overlooking the Hudson River in Englewood, New Jersey. Most of the 24 guests thought they'd been invited to play bridge. When Anne went into labor in the same mansion the next summer, her husband, waiting in the next room, struck up a conversation with Dr. Flagg. The topic was Anne's older sister Elizabeth, whose health had deteriorated dramatically after a bout of rheumatic fever damaged her heart's mitral valve, the valve that regulates the flow of blood from the left atrium into the left ventricle, the heart's main pumping chamber. Lindbergh, who knew a fair bit about valves and machines, was puzzled that a mere valve in the heart, the body's engine as he saw it, could cause so much trouble in an otherwise vibrant woman in her mid-20s. He was similarly vexed to learn that not one of the doctors consulted by Elizabeth's family, several of whom Lindbergh had questioned personally, had any ideas on how to proceed. Lindbergh had several. Remove and replace the broken valve, as he would do in an airplane engine. Replace the entire heart with a mechanical pump, an artificial heart, he called it, just as Lindbergh would replace a failed airplane motor. Or insert a temporary blood pump, remove the heart, fix it, then put it back. Lindbergh spoke to Flagg about Elizabeth Morrow's situation because he noticed that the anesthetist had brought with him a machine he invented to give artificial respiration to newborns in case a breathing emergency arose with a Lindbergh's baby. Fascinated by all things mechanical, Lindbergh asked for permission to examine the device, which was made of an oxygen tank, a pressure regulator, and several feet of rubber tubing. "Would you show me how it works?" he asked. "Of course," Flagg said. After the demonstration, which filled the room with the sound of rushing gas, Lindbergh thought he'd finally found a doctor who would take his own bioengineering ideas seriously. He was right about that. But Flagg didn't think his own specialized training in anesthesiology gave him the expertise to address the complex surgical issues raised by Lindbergh's ideas. "But I know someone who could," he said. A Nobel Prize-winning surgeon Flagg once served as an intern in New York. The surgeon's name, he said, was Alexis Carrel. When Dr. Carrel won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1912, he was the first scientist in the United States to win a Nobel, and at 39, the youngest person yet chosen for any Nobel Prize. The prize honored his perfection of vascular anastomosis, the technique that enables the surgeon to reconnect a blood vessel after it has been cut, patch it if it has been punctured, or attach one vessel to another without damaging the vessel being repaired or rerouted. This new ability to cut and sew arteries and veins, and keep them functioning, made Carrel the father of organ transplantation, which is unthinkable without vascular anastomosis. Likewise, open-heart surgery, coronary artery bypass grafts, kidney dialysis, and countless other procedures that have saved millions would be impossible without Carrel's pioneering work. In the long history of cutting open the body to heal it, Carrel's achievement is perhaps second in importance only to the discovery of anesthesia. Lindbergh, who did most of his reading in aviation journals, knew little of Carrel's achievements when he parked his car on November 28, 1930, near York Avenue and East 66th Street, a part of Manhattan where cows and goats had grazed on a dairy farm only 30 years earlier. Now this green campus was home to the nation's premier biological study center, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, funded by John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil, and its most celebrated department head, 57-year-old Alexis Carrel, whose laboratories and surgery rooms occupied the entire top floor and attic of a 5-story brick-and-stone building constructed in the plain style favored by Mr. Rockefeller, a church-going Baptist. Carrel, a bald, barrel-chested man who viewed the world through pince-nez, was sitting at his desk when Lindbergh arrived for their meeting. Carrel's office, lined with glass-fronted cabinets filled with medical books and antique surgical instruments, was huge. His desk was situated at the far end, so any visitor had to walk some distance to meet him. Lindbergh, who'd been honored in government buildings all over the world, was used to large rooms, so he simply walked across the polished stone floor indifferent to the echo of his footsteps. When he finally reached Carrel, Lindbergh announced himself and extended his right hand. But instead of replying, Carrel raised himself up on his tiptoes. He was nearly a foot shorter than his 6 foot 3 inch guest, and placed his nose almost flush against Lindbergh's. Once there, the surgeon began to examine the aviator's well-documented face, moving his own head back and forth, slowly and repeatedly, as if he were reading a contract. Lindbergh, his hands still in Carrel's, had no idea what was happening, nor did Carrel offer an explanation. If he had, Carrel would have said he was a believer in physiognomy, the now discredited science which holds that the qualities of a person's soul are imprinted on the individual's face by brain waves controlling facial muscles. Carrel was so convinced of this notion that before he would engage in a serious discussion with someone he was meeting for the first time, he often insisted on scanning that person's face closely. If Carrel didn't like what he saw, he walked away. Discussion over. Carrel's secretary, who escorted Lindbergh to Carrel's door, had seen it happen more than once. Lindbergh's suspicion that he'd somehow entered Lewis Carroll's Wonderland became even more intense when he looked back at his examiner. Carrel's probing eyes, magnified by his pince-nez, did not match. One was brown, the other blue. The pilot had been stared at by millions, but never like this. And so the silent scrutiny continued, for seconds that seemed an eternity, until Carrel decided he liked what he saw. "I am Alexis Carrel," he said in his French-inflected English. Carrel had been born and raised in France. "Would you do me the honor of signing my guest book?" That book, already autographed by Winston Churchill, Sarah Bernhardt, and hundreds of others, sat atop Carrel's mahogany desk. After Lindbergh signed, Carrel said he'd be happy to answer whatever questions his visitor had for him in the Institute's lunchroom downstairs. It was there that Lindbergh proposed his radical therapies for his sister-in-law to Carrel. Ignoring the Institute's junior staff members who gawked at the pilot from the lunchroom entrance, Lindbergh was not a garrulous man. He proved that in the nation's capital when, after receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross from President Coolidge, he expressed his gratitude in a speech lasting just over 100 words. But on this occasion, Lindbergh was loquacious. He pushed aside his barely eaten sandwich and nearly full cup of tea and started talking. If there was one subject Lindbergh felt comfortable discussing besides aviation, it was engines. He'd been around them, in planes, in automobiles, and in the tractors and cow-milking machines on his family's Minnesota farm for most of his life. He believed in the power of simple engineering to solve complex problems. Hadn't he bet his life on that assertion, and won, in the spirit of St. Louis? "Surely," Lindbergh said to Carrel, "there's a mechanical solution for Elizabeth Morrow's heart problem. After all, isn't the human heart, for all its undeniable complexity, just a machine, a pump, that can be fixed or replaced like any other?" Unlike Lindbergh, Carrel was a garrulous man, someone far more likely to expound than listen, but on this occasion he listened attentively. He was impressed by the earnest, somewhat gangly person sitting across from him, who, to illustrate the treatment he was proposing with such conviction, took a notebook from his coat pocket and made a simple drawing of the artificial circulation system he envisioned. Carrel was struck by Lindbergh's commitment to his own ideas. Self-confidence was near the top of the attributes Carrel believed necessary for greatness, but he was even more impressed with Lindbergh's hands-on approach. Carrel was a hands-on guy, too. His specialty, cleaving and sewing blood vessels, some only a fraction of a millimeter wide, demanded exceptional dexterity. As a medical student in France, Carrel astounded his professors and annoyed his fellow students who thought him a show-off by sewing 500 stitches in a single piece of cigarette paper. He'd learned to sew from his widowed mother, and later took private lessons from Lyon's most famous embroiderer. Moreover, Carrel was an experimental surgeon. His mandate at the Rockefeller Institute was to devise new surgical techniques for humans by testing them on laboratory animals. He performed the world's first coronary artery bypass graft there, on a dog, in 1910. If there was one doctor in the world ready to test a wholly new surgical approach to heart valve disease, it was Alexis Carrel. But not the one suggested by Lindbergh. After praising the pilot for the boldness of his ideas, Carrel explained why his treatments were untenable, at least for now. For starters, he said, surgeons were as yet unable to stop the heart long enough to operate on it, or even more important, in it, and keep the patient alive. And even if they could, the hammering of pistons inside any mechanical replacement pump would surely damage the delicate red corpuscles of the blood coursing through it. Equally worrying, Carrel said, were the issues of clotting and infection raised by placing such a machine inside the body. Lindbergh's disappointment was soothed by the respect with which Carrel responded to his ideas. He didn't feel patronized. He felt honored that Carrel took the time to explain the shortcomings of his theories. To be treated so courteously and seriously by a Nobel Prize winner, a man whose mind, Lindbergh later wrote, flashed with the speed of light, was a heady experience for someone who'd flunked out of college and barely made it through high school. What Lindbergh didn't know was that Carrel was similarly intoxicated to be talking to him. The pilot was a hero. And in Carrel's interpretation of Darwin, this meant that Lindbergh was one of the elite selected by nature to play the most important role in all of evolution, promoting, by reproduction and example, the optimum growth of the fit. As Carrel saw it, Lindbergh's famous flight showed as much mental courage as physical. The pilot risked his life to challenge the experts who dismissed that flight as suicidal. And now the same young man was trying to smash similar barriers in medicine, even after virtually every doctor he'd talked to had brushed him off. This resolve in the face of skepticism greatly impressed Carrel. The same trait fueled his own experiments, many of which, just like Lindbergh's bid to fly to Paris, were ridiculed before the fact by his surgical peers as impossible. Carrel was so taken with Lindbergh that the surgeon heard himself making an offer he hadn't anticipated. So what if the artificial heart wasn't yet feasible? There were other ways Lindbergh might help his sister-in-law. "If you like," Carrel said to his guest as they rose from their seats in the Rockefeller Institute lunchroom, "I will show you what I am doing here." So they returned to the 5th floor, where Carrel led Lindbergh behind a white screen in the corner of his office. Carrel pointed to a sink located there and told Lindbergh to wash with disinfectant soap. While the pilot did so, Carrel reached into a nearby cabinet, pulling out a surgical mask and a long surgical gown which he handed to his guest once Lindbergh had dried his hands. Both items, Lindbergh noticed, were black. "Please follow me," said Carrel, after donning his own black robe. They walked out of the office, down a wide hallway, and into a rectangular room filled with small cages stacked too high on several rows of long tables. "These," Carrel said, gesturing at the cats and dogs inside the cages, "are my patients." Several of the animals had open wounds on their backs, which had been shaved to make the wounds more visible. Carrel had excised strips of skin from those animals, then applied different substances to the wounds to see which speeded and which retarded the healing process. This study built on work that Carrel, aided by the chemist Henry J. Dakin, performed at a battlefront hospital during World War I. While serving as a surgeon in the French army, Carrel identified the first antiseptic, sodium hypochlorite, buffered with sodium bicarbonate, powerful enough to kill germs in soldiers' wounds, but gentle enough not to destroy healthy tissue along with them. As infection was by far the leading cause of battlefield mortality, this was a massively significant breakthrough, one that saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. In other experiments performed on animals in this room, Carrel sliced open the hearts of anesthetized beasts to stop the flow of blood, then sutured the hearts closed and resuscitated the animals so he could study the effects of the arrested circulation. "After 5 minutes, most animals are resuscitated easily," he told Lindbergh. "After 10 minutes, some appear to have lost their soul. Once, after a longer interruption, I finally succeeded in resuscitating an animal that could breathe and swallow food, but was completely paralyzed and blind." The next room the men entered contained a small refrigerator, which Carrel opened. Inside were translucent containers, each holding a small object Lindbergh couldn't identify. Some of those objects, he could see, were surrounded by a clear, thin liquid, others with a more viscous substance. Carrel reached into the refrigerator, removed one container, opened it, and examined its contents. "The thyroid of a cat," he said. This thyroid was in a state Carrel called latent life. After perfecting his anastomosis technique, which enabled him to graft parts from one animal into another, Carrel began to wonder if the donor animal even needed to be alive for such donations to take place. In 1907, Carrel found that a severed blood vessel stored just above the freezing point, while immersed in saline solution or coated in petroleum jelly, could be successfully transplanted after as long as 2 months of refrigeration. He then began to investigate the viability of grafts done with preserved human parts. In one test, Carrel removed flaps of skin from the washed cadaver of an infant who had died the same morning at a nearby New York hospital. The skin was refrigerated, then used weeks later to patch 4 ulcers on the legs of 2 adults. Most of the grafts took, Carrel reported to the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1912. Carrel also experimented with refrigerating animal semen. These studies anticipated the modern tissue bank and sperm bank by half a century. Across the room from the refrigerator was a large glass-walled structure with its own door. "My mousery," Carrel said, inviting Lindbergh in. Inside were thousands of rodents in bins within interconnected cages. The sound of mice scratching through soil, gnawing on cage bars and vying for alpha male status was impossible to ignore. So was the smell. For several years now, Carrel had been doing a multi-generational breeding study. "Some mice are fed enriched diets, while others are given less," he said. Some mice, in fact, were fed carcinogens or alcohol. Others were exposed to infectious diseases. Some were caged alone, while others were allowed to roam and fight, often to the death. The winners were given females to impregnate. The losers were given autopsies. The purpose of the study was to see how physical and sexual competition, the resulting breeding practices, and the variations in diet and environment contributed to the creation of heroic mice, i.e., mice resistant to disease and endowed with greater strength and longevity. "If I could do the same tests on humans," Carrel said, "I might produce a man who could jump 20 feet in the air and live to be 200. Carrel's research made him a target of animal rights activists who urged the New York State legislature to pass laws banning his work as excessively cruel. But Carrel didn't experiment on animals because he was a sadist. He did so because he was a disciple of Dr. Claude Bernard, the great 19th century French physiologist who created the field of experimental medicine. Whereas anatomists of Bernard's era studied the body's interior by dissecting cadavers, which made them experts on the internal organs' form, physiologists like Bernard investigated how those organs functioned in living bodies. The necessity of finding that latter truth, Bernard conceded, was matched by the unpleasantness encountered in searching for it. "A physiologist no longer hears the cry of animals," Bernard wrote in 1865. "He no longer sees their blood. He sees only his idea and perceives only organisms concealing problems that he intends to solve. To learn how animals live, we cannot avoid seeing them die." Besides, Carrel had used his animal research to make humans live. In a case that helped defeat an anti-vivisection bill then pending in the state legislature, Carrel saved the life of a 5-day-old infant by using the vascular anastomosis technique he developed on dogs. This happened on March 8, 1908, when Carrel received an unexpected visit from Dr. Adrian V.S. Lambert, a professor at Columbia University's medical school. Lambert's wife had given birth to a daughter who exhibited symptoms of melena neonatorum, a rare disease marked by bleeding from the nose, mouth, and anus. When none of the known treatments proved effective, Lambert frantically searched the medical literature for alternatives until he found Carrel's paper on anastomosis. Perhaps a direct blood transfusion using Carrel's new technique would save his daughter's life. Lambert was desperate. He knew that no one in New York, not even Carrel, had ever attempted such a transfusion on a human patient. Even so, Carrel agreed to do the procedure, rushing with Lambert to his apartment on West 36th Street, where Carrel found the baby's anxious mother, the father's 2 brothers, and the sick infant, unconscious and white as a sheet. After a brief discussion with his wife, Dr. Lambert said he would be his daughter's blood donor. This turned out to be a lucky choice, as very little was then understood about blood groups. The baby was taped to an ironing board next to the Lamberts' dining room table, where Lambert lay down. Carrel would anastomose an artery in Lambert's wrist to a vein behind the child's knee. thus joining the healthy father to his sick daughter, so that his blood would replace that being lost by her. After Carrel began cutting, one of Lambert's brothers blotted up the blood with a dish towel. Once under the baby's skin, Carrel, working without the magnifying lenses today's surgeons take for granted, occluded the appropriate vessels, severed them, then used his revolutionary anastomosis method to join them end to end. Carrel's Nobel-winning innovation involved placing stay sutures in the two vessels he planned to join. Once gently tugged, those stays transformed two round vessels into two triangles, which Carrel sewed together, one straight line at a time. As every tailor knows, it's easier to sew a straight line than a curved one. What Carrel the surgeon knew was that sewing in a straight line prevented the tissue being linked from buckling, and so prevented damage to the vessel's inner lining. This in turn eliminated the possibility of clotting and infection, the problems that had defeated all previous attempts to devise a workable anastomosis method. Soon the vascular bond was complete on the Lambert infant. No small feat, considering that her vein was thinner than copper wire and flimsier than wet tissue paper. Within moments, the baby's color changed from white to pink, then red. "You'd better turn it off or she'll burst," one of Lambert's brothers said, his joy tinged with anxiety. 2 decades later, Carrel attended his patient's 21st birthday party. That outcome gave Carrel great satisfaction. But, as he told Lindbergh while they walked toward another room at the Institute, his research in recent years had moved beyond vascular surgery. These new experiments took place in Carrel's incubation chamber. This space was heated to 37 degrees Celsius, 98.6 Fahrenheit, and kept moist to mimic the interior of a mammal's body by steam jets in the walls. The experimental subjects in this room weren't likely to raise the ire of animal rights activists. They weren't even fully formed animals. They were microscopic pieces of tissue, some from laboratory animals, others from humans, that Carrel kept alive in tissue culture flasks. More than a dozen such flasks, lined up on a workbench, were visible in the incubator room. Carrel, a founding father of tissue culture, was the first scientist in the world to grow human tissue outside the body. He did that by adapting work done by the zoologist Ross G. Harrison. Harrison had made history himself in 1907 by keeping brain tissue from a frog embryo alive in a drop of frog lymph, sealed in a hollow glass slide, for several weeks. Carrel was impressed by Harrison's feat, but knew it wouldn't have any medical consequences until tissue from higher animals could be cultured as well. This Carrel achieved in studies at the Rockefeller Institute that substituted mammalian and human tissues for amphibian, adult tissues for embryonic, blood plasma for lymph as the culture medium, and in some tests, cancerous tissues for healthy ones. That last innovation, which enabled scientists to watch malignant cells as they grew, was the beginning of modern cancer research. In a similarly groundbreaking study, Carrel proved that cultured cells produce antibodies, just as cells inside the body do, after antigens are added to the culture medium. This was a hugely important step in the creation of the modern vaccine industry. Careful maintenance was required to keep Carrel's tissue cultures nourished, infection-free, and rinsed of waste products. One of Carrel's technicians, dressed in a black robe like Lindbergh's, but topped by a black hood covering his entire face, save for a slit revealing his eyes, was attending to those duties while peering through a microscope when Carrel and Lindbergh entered the room. "Would you like to see what he's seeing?" Carrel asked. "Yes, I would," Lindbergh said. After the technician vacated his seat, Carrel took it, looked through the microscope, and then offered the same chair to Lindbergh, who lowered his eyes to the lens. What the pilot saw was that the human tissue, which resembled a nearly transparent stone wall, was surrounded by a milky bluish substance, Carrel's plasma medium, leaving a grainy substance at the shared border. "Can you see the granulation?" Carrel asked. When Lindbergh nodded, Carrel said the granulation was evidence that the human tissue was reaching out, taking in food from the medium, and proliferating. Carrel then invited Lindbergh to the corner of the incubation room, where, on a table all by itself, lay Carrel's most famous tissue culture experiment. In fact, the most famous tissue culture experiment in the world. This experiment began on January 17, 1912, when Carrel...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?